brilliant host of the great show at 11 p.m., Laura Coates Live. You can catch it on CNN weeknights, Monday through Friday. You may have even seen my handsome face on that show, thanks to her. Laura Coates joined us here. Laura, so glad for you being on the program today. Thank you so much for hopping on.
I'm so glad to be here. I love when you come on, so I'm happy to be in your house at this point in time. And of course, so much has happened since the last time you and I spoke, so I'm looking forward to catching up, my friend.
Yeah, that's right. Well, first, I do want to truly thank you because without the home that you've provided and the space that you've provided, Nick and I, my co hosts who couldn't join us today, 4 years ago, we started our show to add to the discourse. And as you know, I'm somebody who produced at the competing network down the street that sometimes is a little bit part of the misinformation. I wanted to do something about that. So you've truly have elevated this platform. So we can't thank you enough, first and foremost, for having me on the program to add to that discourse that we're trying to do. And one thing I did want to touch on with you, just as we start here, because we just covered in the first segment the brush fires that have happened, wildfires in LA. And it's just been crazy to see some of these stories. I'm going to play a sound for you in a second of somebody's story that you've told, Chuck Hart, who had that incredible story about saving his mom and his mom's house. But just for you covering this, because a lot of the times you are the West Coast anchor, you are the 8 p.m. primetime anchor for these folks getting their news and information. And I remember as these fires started to escalate, I believe it was Tuesday into the late night hours, this was really your sweet spot in terms of covering this. What have you learned so much about what's been taking place there in LA, hearing from county officials, the folks that you've had on the program? How's this all been playing out for Laura Coates watching this?
I, like so many people, have been watching in horror, not only at the mere fact that it's happening, but the scope, the fact that it's ongoing, the frustrations that people have, the questions of why this, why there, why so long. And it's been something that for me as a journalist has it makes me all the more aware of just how important information is, period. Right? Not there's no spin, there's no thumb on a scale. It's that people desperately need to have information. They need for safety reasons. They need to understand what might come next. They need to process it. And they're seeing it in this way, in these devastating circumstances. But I also think it's important, as much as name recognition of celebrities is always something that makes people lean in, the real stories to be told, in addition to those, is that this is happening to everyday Americans, names you don't recognize, don't know, communities maybe you're barely familiar with, or maybe you're intimately aware of, who knows. But making sure that the stories that we tell are the same scope of the devastation. That it's not just, oh, I know this actor, I know this performer, I'm going to focus on the loss that they have experienced because I know who this person is. It's, listen, this could be you. Look what the average person is dealing with. Somebody who believes that their home was their nest egg, someone who has had it in different generations, somebody who just has a safe space and reprieve for their family, what they're going through right now. And I think those stories need to be told. People think, well, that's not politics, and or that's not the current events or the news of the world. Those are all of those things in one, because as much as people believe, and I always talk to you about this, that people know that POTUS stands for the President of the United States. I think of it as the people of the United States. And so I want to know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and what they're going through. And it has just been devastating to watch. And I've interviewed so many people who, a week ago today had nothing like this on their radar, right? Days before today, they had a safe space. They had a sink full of dishes. They had a paycheck coming on Friday and a job on Monday. They were thinking about the orders in their restaurants and whether it's going to be fish on Friday, whether it's going to be, do they have their kids' soccer equipment? Do they have their landscaping materials that they just invested in? And all of a sudden that was gone in the blink of an eye. And now the story is as much about them, about why. Why are they still going through? What can be done?
Yeah, no,
Sorry for
and
that.
you're spot on there with a bunch that you said. So I want to play the sound real quick and ask you a follow-up question after this,
Sure.
because this is from Chuck Hart, who was a contractor who happened to be working in the area in Pacific Palisades. He has this incredible story that he talks about because he happened to be working a job site nearby, gets a phone call from his mother, rushes to the site to help her, and he had a couple friends with him. Then you kind of asked him something as he's getting through the emotional phase of this, right? In terms of how he's processing all this. So take a listen to this.
I would say it's more like I work really well under pressure for
Hmm.
my job, for just the purposes of focusing in my own life. I do really well there.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel really emotional about that. I felt really connected and engaged.
But what
My
happened when the adrenaline
scoutmaster,
stopped?
it hasn't. And I
Oh,
guess it has maybe about a day and a half ago, and I just burst into tears. And it happened again this afternoon. I'm here with a buddy of mine, Elton, and we just stopped to talk for a minute. And when you're
mm.
when you don't think about it as much, and you're just busy, it doesn't bother me. I usually that's how I kind of move around through my life in general. I just try to do the next indicated right action and stay out of stuff that makes me sad or maybe even feel depressed because I want to be of maximum service to the people around me. I want to be engaged and I want to be into action.
So you can kind of hear it there in his voice, and you were just mentioning before in your response about being a journalist and asking questions. In the first segment, Nick and I played some sound from Gavin Newsom doing some recent media interview rounds. What are the questions that Laura Coates wants to ask now of officials in the community? Because there's been the infighting between the LA fire chief and obviously Mayor Karen Bass. There's been Mayor Karen Bass kind of taking this trip to Ghana, which a lot of people will tell you just look on the political surface, it doesn't look good when LA is on fire. And then obviously there's the response from Gavin Newsom. There's the federal stuff of the Trump administration coming in. What are some questions that Laura Coates wants to ask of public elected officials so that way the people that are watching her show, the ones that are affected in Los Angeles, can get the answers that they demand?
But one moment that I go back to is when a woman was confronting the governor of California, and saying, can I listen to your conversation with President Biden? I want to know about the water. I want to know what the plan is and how will you stop it from happening again? I have the same questions that they have as everyday people. Myself being a mother and everyday person wondering how to keep her family safe. But I also want to ask, taking a step back, when will you realize that people don't just want listening sessions? When will you realize that when there is devastation and we are in crisis mode, whether as a nation or a community or whatever microcosm you exist in, that your reaction cannot be to people, we want to hear you, we want to listen? Because I don't know about for you, I am somebody who certainly would like to be heard in my viewpoints, but it almost feels dismissive to me at times when people simply say, knowing the weight of the world on people, that the reaction is going to be to listen, because that triggers them to say, we're going to listen, then we're going to have a long investigation, and then a report's going to come out eventually. And, you kick the can down the proverbial bureaucratic road. My questions are more in the short term, with an eye towards the long term, but in the short term, what is the plan in terms of trying to get immediate help and relief for children going to schools whose schools have now been burned down? How are they going to stay on par with their peers in other jurisdictions? What are the outlets that are going to be available to them to be able to study and go to school? What about mortgage payments that are going to come due and rent payments that are going to come due? And I'm looking at a house that doesn't have any walls, and I've got a bank saying, I'm so sorry to hear that. Could you please make sure it's on time with interest? Otherwise, you're going to go in default. And there goes your credit rating, and forget your future and other things. What about my credit card statements? What about the ability to get some semblance of information to streamline a process for insurance reporting? And also, what are we going to do about insurance industries that said or anticipated they're being lost and said, yeah, no more policies for you? What answers can you give them? Those are sort of the immediate needs I think people are facing when you look around and say, what now? That's where I would want to go. Certainly, I have questions about in the long term about issues related to budgets and how to prepare a 2025 fire protection and fire department that meets the needs of the anticipated fires that are coming, the water, the access to it, being able to fill up the different drums and tanks that are necessary in those highlands. What are the drone rules that are going to be enforced while you've got these super scoopers happening? I mean, I have the range of questions, but for me, the questions I would be asking, is what do I do not eventually, but what are you going to do for me right now? I mean, I've got real needs right now. And it's just something that I think people who have asked for a position of power and asked to lead are required to not just give overtures and be an audience to those who they represent, but be an advocate. So how are they planning to do that today?
As I told my buddy Mark, who listens to this program, you're listening to me, but you're not hearing me. He's like, I hear you. I'm like, well, then
Mm-hmm.
you're hearing me and you're not listening to me. So it's one
Yep.
of the other, brother. So like,
Yeah.
so I want to pivot off of that because it kind of funnels into the follow up in terms of the Trump administration coming in now, because obviously there was a little back and forth. Nick and I just covered in the first segment about President Trump's words recently down in Mar-a-Lago with some of the Republican governors about how Gavin Newsom has kind of handled this.
Mm-hmm.
First, for you, just as a journalist, the Trump administration's coming in next week, obviously, is the inauguration. What are you looking to cover, or what do you think about these first 100 days? Like, what's going to be the segment producers of Laura Coates Live, some of who I know, you know that. So, what are these people going to be focusing on in terms of covering the incoming administration? Obviously, there's a portion of this in terms of how he handles federal dollars and dissemination of that to states, which we saw during the pandemic, some of the back and forth between governors and President Trump. But what are some things that are on Laura Coates' menu in terms of covering the incoming Trump administration and this first 100 days, the cabinet, the confirmation hearings, and all of that?
Well, first, I will cover this administration the way I cover every administration, with the healthy amount of skepticism and open-mindedness that government requires and democracy demands, and asking questions not with an eye towards knowing the answer. I think people have to ask questions because I want to understand your position, not because I want to use you as a vehicle to convey my own feelings about an issue. I think that's number one, important to think about. Number two, I've always been kind of chuckling about the arbitrariness of the first 100 days, right? Everyone's like, the first 100 days are going to mean a lot. First of all, they plan for that. Every administration plans to have everything come out, the fireworks the first 100 days. They know that we're looking at the first 100 days, but I'm more interested in the 101 through the rest of the days and figuring out, once the attention on the hoopla is gone, what are you actually doing and what's in the periphery of things that I'm not seeing out front. So I'll be looking at that. I also want to know about the intersection between what's happened for all these cans that were kicked down the road. You've got, Speaker Johnson retaining the gavel. You've still got to deal with the budgetary issues. You've got to deal with the request to have this massive bill. You've got to work with Democrats who, on the one hand, are going to want to pop some popcorn. On the other hand, know full well that they've got some explaining to do to the American people and themselves about how the results of the election were very different than what they anticipated as well. And so I'm going to be focusing on the stories, not only that are impacting what happens on Capitol Hill, but as you know, as my constant focus, what happens outside this beltway. I'm raised in Minnesota, before that, Massachusetts. I'm not somebody who thinks of myself as the Washington insider and only caring about this little traffic pattern here. It's important, yes, but the main streets across America and the people who are on the front lines are the city level officials, are the state's attorneys general, are the people who are going to have to deal with whatever priorities are established in Washington and are impacting their constituents in different ways. So that's going to be my focus, and trying to make sure that those stories are covered. But I got to tell you, the lawyer in me is going to be leaning in to what the Department of Justice is doing. It's going to be leaning into some of these major trials that are coming up. Some are calling the case of the defendant now, Luigi Mangione, a political intersection of populism and anger. Others would call it appropriately alleged homicide. I say alleged because, of course, he is presumed innocent, even in this instance. The intersections of where that meets, I'll be interested in following. And also, in the next most immediate future, these confirmation hearings, Mike. I mean, we're probably going to cover things that normally you wouldn't have wall to wall, but I will not be missing an opportunity to hear what RFK Jr. has to say about a number of issues, or Pete Hegseth, or Governor Kristi Noem, former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, Pam Bondi in the Attorney General's office as well. I'm looking forward to having a microphone in front of each to better understand what their plans really will be and how they can be implemented.
So much you said there because I was a weekend PA on Fox and Friends. So I always make the joke. I didn't realize I could be up for a cabinet position because Pete was the guy that I worked with. So anyway, but that's
You
neither
still
here.
might, I don't know, do you have a relationship? We don't know.
I happen to know Pete. I know people over there. The first text I sent to somebody over there, they were like, he is woefully unqualified for something like that. But I don't even want to get into that because we can get into that on your show, Laura Coates Live, 11 p.m. weeknights. But I did want to ask you, you just mentioned that you were a former federal prosecutor. So I want you to put the lawyer hat on here for a couple of things that I wanted to ask you. First, obviously last week was the sentencing hearing. I saw you and my buddy Ellie Honig on television last week talking about the sentencing hearing and then obviously what came down from this. And obviously we all knew that nothing was going to come in terms of jail time for the president just because of the optics of all of this. And he was still required to, obviously appear via the Zoom for sentencing. So I'm interested first for you, the way this is all played out from the political landscape has been these cases have dissipated because he's come back into power. Maybe they don't go this direction if Kamala Harris wins. Obviously, we all think that. Now we're here. We know that as evidenced by what happened in New York. Just from a former federal prosecutor perspective, I don't think I've ever heard you say this, so I would love to get an answer about this. Would you have brought this New York case? Because the New York case is the only one we got tried and adjudicated. It's the only one that legal analysts everywhere said it had the least legal merit or at least meat on the bones in terms of what you wanted to hold the former president, now president-elect, accountable for. And yet it's the only one that we saw to the finish line. And the American people, at least more than 50%, feel it was politicized. As a former federal prosecutor, what says Laura Coates?
When I thought about bringing cases, I looked at a number of factors. One, of course, was the criminal code and the statutes that were available to me. The facts, of course, and what I could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And of course, you're always balancing as a prosecutor and exercising your discretion, the amount of resources you want to devote to a particular case, knowing the breadth of opportunities to try to pursue justice in a whole host of matters. I have to tell you, this is one of those cases in New York where there is the novelty of the application that has some people wondering whether it will be able to withstand the appellate process. I say that because it is novel to be able to bring a state court action based on a alleged federal crime. Now, that's not something that, you get in the weeds of things people are often thinking about. They think about the facts, they hear terms like catch and kill, they hear things like, porn star, and they think about the salacious nature of the charges. They know figures like a Michael Cohen or a Stormy Daniels, or they came to know Hope Hicks, or they came to know Donald Trump in that vein. And so there's a lot of conflation as to how people see this, but there is room for interpretation as to whether they are prevented from having brought an action like this. And as it stands, we are all waiting to see what the appellate court says about that. I will say that there is an unfairness when people are assessing each individual case about Donald Trump, when we look at it as one big body. Part of the criticism of the Manhattan DA when he first brought the case, aside from whether he should bring the case, when he decided to bring the case, was why would he go first? Why should he go first? Come on, all the cases, why should he go first? They criticized the order of things. Then it became a criticism of, well, wait, why is he going first? Why hasn't, Merrick Garland's brought more cases that were in line? Is he too slow in this process? And are we criticizing the right situation? I think that if the Manhattan DA's team believed that they had the statutory basis and the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which a jury found they did, then they were entitled to bring this action. I was in the courtroom for a trial, and not every day, but I was certainly in the courtroom. And I did not see the judge acting in the biased way he was accused of having acted by Trump. The jury selection process did not yield the political bias answers that Trump anticipated, and the way that the actual trial was prosecuted and the defense argued the case. It wasn't the politics were not as they were in the hallway, as described by Trump. So I think the jury was entitled to come to the conclusion they had based on the presentation of evidence. In any event, you're right. The judge considered the fact that there was an election, that there is a president-elect, and that, as the prosecutor, Josh Steinglass, said, the American people have every right to have a president unencumbered by criminal prosecutions going into office. And I think they respected that and had to balance the fact that a jury found him guilty. But welcome to the wild, wild west, where we have to determine the ethical parameters and the political intersections, just as if we are flying in a plane that we're building. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so interested to see whether the accusations of a weaponized government and a politicized DOJ will be the priority in Pam Bondi's administration, if confirmed, or the perhaps incoming FBI director, or the focus of weaponization committees on Congress. But at the end of the day, the appellate court has got to be in a position to determine whether someone's gone outside the bounds of what we consider constitutional or appropriate. We're not there yet, so I'll withhold judgment.
You know, in Law and Order, there's always a scene at the end where they're at the bar discussing or debriefing the case, and Sam Waterston's talking to whoever it is, the associate AD at the time, I forget her name. If Laura Coates was in those shoes right now at that proverbial bar, seeing some of these cases, this is just as a one-off for my own edification here. You see and you hear some of these cases and the way, you know, they were tried, pled out, whatever it is. And now you see some of the cases obviously go away and Jack Smith's special counsel. What is the legal community saying about that? We're setting a dangerous precedent. I can't believe any of these things didn't even come to fruition. We're blaming investigators, the DOJ. What are some of those things that you guys would be saying to each other right now?
Well, first of all, if I was at the proverbial bar, I would not touch that peanut bowl because I'm a germaphobe. Like, what are we doing? It's not happening. I'm not doing it.
Agreed.
Number two, I think that a lot of people are really focusing less on the individual trials and more on the Supreme Court of the United States. When they look at this composition ideologically and how the decisions have come out, that has been the overwhelming focus of many legal scholars to figure out whether the immunity decision about official acts, just take a step back, what they were talking about, they ultimately concluded that you could not criminally prosecute a president based on official acts. There is an immunity they enjoyed based on the official acts. There's a good reason for that, to think about why you want to immunize somebody in their official capacity. Otherwise, every elected official would fear making decisions that are based on their official conduct and could be swayed either way with the fear of prosecution. The question is, it comes down to the devil of the details. What is official and what is not? What ought to be official acts of a presidency and what are, frolics and detours away from it? And I think people have real concerns about the Supreme Court and the circuit courts of appeals, what they will say about defining the power and the constraints on power for the executive branch. The day-to-day trials, those are important and they're interesting and they have a lot of weight. But at the end of the day, the Supreme Court's decisions will shape the way in which these courts are able to rule and prosecutors are able to bring cases and prove them. So that's where my focus is looking as well.
Well, Laura, you just mentioned the Supreme Court. So let's get into the case that 170 million people would be affected by here in the United States, of which my wife is downstairs playing and sending me reels from. And that's TikTok. Because, obviously, I don't know how much you know of my background. 15 years as a product manager, working in product and technology, launching the very app that your show streams on with HBO Max, and now called Max. But there's something about these social media platforms and content modification, being able to opt into terms of use policy, privacy policies, and things like that. But at the core of this case with TikTok is selling and ByteDance selling to a US-based company because of the data collections and the fears around that. And obviously, we know what has happened from a legislation standpoint in terms of Congress. Where do you think this case kind of nets out here? Because this is probably the first one we've seen really attacking a social media giant that happens to be partially owned by a company based in China with U.S. and other foreign location offices. But what do you make of the Supreme Court hearing the oral arguments about this? And where do you think that they will net out in the process of this? And what does it speak to about the larger in terms of social media platforms in 2025 and beyond?
Well, there's a reason the Supreme Court took this on an accelerated basis, agreeing to have the oral arguments back in December and now needing to decide the issue, presumably before the ban goes into effect on January 19th, the day before the inauguration of a president-elect who has said that the TikTok audience and the demographics that of the youth and beyond aided in his successful presidential campaign. So there's taking a step back of why this is here. Congress, as you articulated, decided that they did not want to have this company owning TikTok distributed to so many Americans because they had national security concerns. They believed that there could be instances where a foreign government had too much access to personal information and could exploit it in some way. Well, go to the Supreme Court where they're trying to decide the legitimacy of a ban such as this, where there's First Amendment concerns at play, and First Amendment in the wider scope of things. People often think about free speech in the First Amendment, freedom of the press. That's part of the argument they're raising. Free speech, people have every right to participate in a platform of their choosing and to express themselves in any way. And by trying to ban it, you are, as a government, infringing on their ability to have expression. But the other part of it is association. Do you truly have freedom of association of who you choose to associate with, and also your followers or beyond, and with which entities and companies, no matter who owns it, you have a freedom to be able to do so? Well, there is a history of the government limiting, when it comes to association or the First Amendment, the ability for, say, radio licenses that are owned by a foreign government. There's a history where the United States government does not allow for similar aspects of it because they are fearful of national security or the information sources being able to convey inaccurate misinformation, outright lies, political propaganda that can be detrimental to the United States' national security interests. So there is a history of that. The balance for this Supreme Court is twofold. One, balancing the First Amendment interests of the everyday person. The other is the legitimate national security interest that a legislative branch, co-equal branch of government, has described as important. So balancing these two things, they're not necessarily thinking about the average person who might be making their livelihood off of this, or people wanting to, enjoy the platform for their own reasons. They're thinking about those two primary points: the government's interest in regulating behavior that might have a national security implication, and the First Amendment balance of not being able to infringe. The fact that there are other social outlets for people to have communication might ultimately weigh very heavily on the court's mind. Certainly, TikTok has become very important as a conduit of information, as a platform, but there are other ways that a person could communicate, could freely express, and freely associate. So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court is always balancing the government interest against the public's interest in something and the private interest in something. And from the oral arguments, Mike, it did not seem as though they were really in an uproar over a TikTok ban. Perhaps because they think that others might eventually purchase it, restoring access in some ways. Also, they can't necessarily take it right off your phone and tell you can't, learn your next dance, or who's the girl I love, the ASMR. She's in formal gowns and she's cutting fruit, making her own version of Capri Sun. Love that. They can't necessarily do this. So I think we're going to see how it ultimately comes down. But unlike most cases of the Supreme Court waiting to the end of the term, we're likely going to know that by design and by necessity, even before the inauguration. But can you imagine TikTok, people have invested so much in it, suddenly not being the central focus? I mean, the American public, hell, the consuming public is quite fickle and might find a replacement. But this seems like a pretty, integrated platform for so many people.
Breaking down TikTok dances, human interest stories in terms of LA,
Yep.
analysis, asking questions of elected officials. You can catch all of this and more, including Laura and I's banter. Laura Coates
Yes.
Live. That's right, 11 p.m. weeknights, 8 p.m. Set the DVR. I want to say something before I let you go here, Laura. There's a structural thing that I look for in shows as being a producer, not only at ESPN and Fox News and some other places, but the structural part of this in terms of political analysis and panels and how many guests you have on. Is it too cluttered on the screen? Can you get all of this into 7 minutes? I think nobody does it better right now on CNN than you and your team. And I truly mean that. And I don't say that because you have me on often. I say that because I truly watch this stuff and I look at how everybody else is doing it in the marketplace, who truly adds to the discourse and allows people their voices to be heard in 7 minutes. It's incredibly challenging. Nobody does it better than you. Laura,
Hey,
thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much, Mike. I mean, I gotta tell you, thank you for having me on. Thank you for always coming on. You are one of the guests I always look forward to having on because I'm genuinely interested in what you have to say and how you think. And I always tell my kids, because they're elementary school and the teacher's always saying, show your work, show your work. And they hate having to show their work. But I love to watch you show the work. You show the work of the process of thinking. You are one of those guests and one of those hosts on your show as well, your podcast as well, where people have two reactions. Either that's what I was thinking, or finally someone is addressing what I wanted to know about. And so kudos to you, my friend. Hope to have you on soon. I do see that my book is not on your shelf. I'll send you one.
Oh, that's right. I like it. And by the way, the reason why I think like that, I'm a Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx. So you're not going to win an argument against us. So thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.